In approximately 2 weeks, fanboys, fangirls, nerds and geeks of all ages, races, and religious backgrounds will come together, their bespectacled eyes welling with tears of joy, their limp-wristed fists raised to the sky in triumph to celebrate a momentous occasion. I'm referring, of course, to the December 18th release of Star Wars Episode 7, The Search for More Money. I mean, The Force Awakens. My thanks to Mel Brooks for that joke. So I thought it appropriate to take this moment, my last sermon before December 18th, to speak a bit about the Star Wars mythos and what lessons we Unitarian Universalists might draw from it. This should not be an entirely surprising topic for a Sunday morning worship service. Since the release of the original trilogy in the 1970s and 1980s, Star Wars has been recognized as a deeply spiritual story, drawing inspiration from the wisdom, the philosophy, and theology of various world religions. George Lucas, the creator of Star Wars, himself is on record citing Joseph Campbell's work on mythological archetypes as a source for his story. Now, before I dig in this morning, and we're going to dig deep, I want to recognize that not everyone in this sanctuary or listening at home is equally familiar with the Star Wars universe. I know, for example, that some of you here have never even seen the original movies, while others here spend their late nights hunched over their computer screens playing Knights of the Old Republic, writing Wookiee fan fiction, and sobbing quietly underneath their rubber Admiral Akbar masks. Because this audience is so diverse in its knowledge of Star Wars, and because of my limited time this morning, I need to lay down some boundaries. So this morning, for source material, I will be making no appeals whatsoever to the Star Wars expanded universe. For the purposes of this sermon, that material simply does not exist. So to all the Star Wars fans out there, do not send me any hate mail this week talking about plot points from the Clone Wars or the Dark Empire comics or the Force Unleashed or whatever. We are limiting source material to the 6 movies, possibly the holiday special. Let's start with a very basic plot summary for those unfamiliar with the story. On a planet way out in space, like really, really far out there, there's a young farm boy named Luke Skywalker, and he dreams of joining the Rebel Alliance in its fight against the evil Galactic Empire. When his home is destroyed by the Empire, Luke teams up with Han Solo, Princess Leia, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, whom we later find out is one of the last survivors of an ancient order of noble warriors known as the Jedi. Obi-Wan, like all of the Jedi Order, has magical powers, which stem from his ability to manipulate a godlike, ubiquitous energy field called the Force. Our intrepid heroes seek out and destroy the evil empire's greatest weapon, something we call the Death Star. On the way, they meet an evil black cyborg named Darth Vader, a former Jedi who has turned to the so-called dark side of the Force. Vader, we find out, is a Sith, which is like the dark counterpart to the Jedi Order. And it was Vader and the Sith who were responsible for murdering all of the Jedi years ago. Well, after destroying the Death Star, the Rebel Alliance is pursued across the galaxy by Darth Vader and the evil Empire. Luke Skywalker leaves the Alliance for a time to become trained as a Jedi under the tutelage of Master Yoda, a wise, funny-voiced, aphorism-spewing, swamp-dwelling, small green Muppet. Master Yoda, teaches Luke the ways of the Force. He tells Luke that the Force has a light side and a dark side. He warns Luke to use only the light and never, ever, ever, don't even think about it, ever use the dark. Luke cuts his Jedi training short to go save his friends who have been captured by Darth Vader, whom we then discover, now hold on, if there's anybody in here that hasn't seen these movies, and my sermon might be inspiring you to go watch them, I'm about to give you a spoiler here, so spoiler alert, cover your ears. All right, we then discover that Darth Vader is actually Luke Skywalker's father. I know, right? So Vader tries to lure Luke to the dark side. Luke tries to make Vader turn back to the light side. In the meantime, Princess Leia puts on a metal bikini, and we meet some more small Muppets who use twigs and rocks to defeat the army of the evil Galactic Empire, even though the Empire's soldiers are in full armor and equipped with laser cannons. This is why I'm a Star Trek fan. Eventually, Darth Vader takes Luke to see his evil master, the Emperor. When the Emperor also fails to turn Luke to the dark side, he uses his dark force powers to shoot him with lightning bolts out of his fingers. Vader watches this, and seeing his own son writhing in pain, well, it breaks him. And he suddenly turns on the Emperor, sacrificing his own life, and thus saving his son Luke and bringing an end to the evil empire. That, in a nutshell, covers the basic plot of the original trilogy. Now, I was a child when the original Star Wars trilogy came out, and I loved it. I had the action figures, the Halloween costumes, the plastic lightsaber. I wanted to grow up and become a Jedi Knight. Now, obviously, what most attracted me as a child to the Jedi was their super cool laser swords and their ability to move things with their minds. But I also have to admit that their Jedi philosophy, their morality, as presented in the original trilogy, was incredibly compelling to me in its direct and childlike simplicity. There's a light side, and there's a dark side. Like the Jedi, you should always stay on the light side and try to avoid the dark side because light is all good, dark is all bad. Perfect. Lined up beautifully with my pre-existing religious notions from my Christian upbringing. Nearly 20 years after the original Star Wars trilogy, George Lucas released a new Star Wars trilogy. They were prequels to the original, the backstory of how Luke Skywalker's father, Anakin Skywalker, started out as a virtuous, noble Jedi only to fall to the temptations of the Sith and the dark side of the Force, and thus become Darth Vader. So in 1999, the first movie of the new trilogy came out, entitled Star Wars Episode I: The Saga of Jar Jar Binks. Now, I was there in the theater on opening day in 1999 to watch that movie. And I have to say, it was, without a doubt, the worst movie I have ever seen in my entire life. It was an embarrassing 2-hour parade of bad acting, bad directing, bad scripting, bad everything. But something really important happened in that movie that changed my understanding of the Star Wars universe forever. In Episode 1, it is revealed that Anakin Skywalker, the future Darth Vader, was the chosen one, prophesied to restore balance to the Force. Restore balance to the Force. For those of us who grew up watching the original Star Wars trilogy, this phrase was as mind-blowing as it was blasphemous. Who could possibly want a balance between the light and dark sides of the Force? The whole point of the original trilogy was about the struggle between light and dark, good and evil, right and wrong, and the light's eventual total vanquishing of the triumph over the dark side. That's what Star Wars is about. There's no room for a balance of light and dark. The revelation of these words of prophecy signaled a massive philosophical shift in the Star Wars universe, from a dualistic Judeo-Christian inspired theology to a predominantly Taoist philosophy anchored in the concept of yin-yang, where opposite forces are inextricably intertwined with one another in a complementary rather than purely antagonistic relationship. And re-examining all 6 Star Wars movies from this new perspective, which I did this weekend, I have personally come to this perhaps somewhat counterintuitive conclusion. The light and dark sides of the Force are not synonymous with good and evil. The real evil in the Star Wars universe is not darkness, but rather the unjust imbalance of power and the moral absolutism that creates that imbalance. And that the Jedi Order, the self-proclaimed guardians of justice and peace throughout the galaxy, were actually just as evil as the Sith. Moreover, it was the Jedi who were directly responsible and morally culpable for the great suffering that happened to the galaxy under the oppression of the Empire. This is a subversive reading of the text, to say the least. To make my case, let us start by examining the purported values of the dark side of the Force, and I say purported because almost everything we know about the dark side of the Force comes from the Jedi, who are the sworn enemy of the Sith and the dark side. The Sith, as Thomas mentioned this morning, derive their power from their passions. They are ruled by the heart, not the head. They embrace emotions, including the more primitive and dangerous emotions of fear, anger, and hate. The dark side is said to be mysterious and inscrutable, hard to see and hard to understand. These descriptors stand in contradistinction to the values of the Jedi Order. The Jedi, you have to understand, were essentially designed to be space samurai. And this is evident by their style of dress, even the way they handle their lightsabers. So it's no coincidence then that the values of the Jedi, as written by George Lucas, they are particularly Buddhist-y, with a splash of Gnostic Christianity. The Jedi values include a desire for peace and order. They practice presence, quieting the mind through regular meditation. They believe in self-control, detachment, calm. They have a goal of avoiding suffering. And one Jedi even stated that compassion is central to the life of the Jedi. These are wonderful, beautiful values and practices. The world would be a better place if we all could be more like those Jedi. And some of the most wonderful people I know in real life hold these values and practices, Buddhists, Christians, and UUs alike. But even the noblest, most benign virtues, when taken to an absolutist extreme, can become evil, or so says Star Wars. And that extremism, that absolutism, that fundamentalism, I believe, is evident within the Jedi Order throughout all 6 Star Wars movies if you're open to look for them. The path of the Jedi, for example, is extreme. And it's extreme by design. They live a life of austerity and asceticism. Jedi students are constantly told to bury their feelings. Jedi are to have no desire for adventure or excitement. This is wrong. Jedi students are taught that displaying anger is bad. Attachments of all kinds are completely, expressly forbidden. So the Jedi cannot marry, they cannot fall in love, they cannot have children. Jedi are forbidden from mourning or even missing the dead. Possessions are strictly forbidden to the Jedi. And perhaps possessions are forbidden because the Jedi seem to have such little regard for the physical world we all share. Jedi are constantly told to ignore their physical senses, as if one cannot learn important truths by studying and observing the physical world. The Jedi appear to be relatively skeptical of both science and technology. At one point, Yoda claims, as Gina mentioned, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. Sounds good at first blush, but many of us here in this sanctuary have more than a passing familiarity with faith systems that put similarly little value on this so-called crude matter, which makes up this planet, which is our home and our bodies. For many of us, crude matter matters. Yet the Jedi devalue this physical world. The Jedi also value predictability and certainty. In quieting their minds, Jedi are told also to clear the mind of both questions and doubts. The masters of the Jedi Order, they guard knowledge tightly. We see them repeatedly, purposely, and paternalistically withholding information about the dark side of the Force and the Sith from their students. From the Jedi Masters refusing to teach their students the stories and history of the Sith, like the story of Darth Plagueis, for those that are deep in it, or to Obi-Wan simply lying to Luke about what really happened to his father. And in episode 3, we see Yoda tell another Jedi Master to keep a secret from the Galactic Senate, the secret that their power to sense the Force had recently diminished, to keep the secret that they weren't as strong as they thought they were. As you can see, the Jedi are fairly preoccupied with the idea of control. As such, they look down upon defiance and dissent within their own ranks. In episode 1, a Jedi Knight named Qui-Gon Jinn was denied a position of leadership on the Jedi Council because he was labeled as defiant by Yoda, even though he was otherwise qualified. Throughout the movies, the language of the Jedi is surprisingly absolutist and fear-inducing. Whenever a Jedi turns to the dark side of the Force, for example, he is labeled as dead to the Order. It is said that the dark side is something one must be saved from. On multiple occasions, Yoda tells a Jedi student, and this is a quote, "Once you start down the dark path, forever will it dominate your destiny." That quote is said repeatedly throughout the series. Yoda engages in fundamentalistic fear-mongering in claiming that simply starting down the dark path will seal your fate forever. And perhaps the greatest and most obvious hypocrisy of the Jedi comes in episode 3, when Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jedi Master, tells Anakin Skywalker, quote, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes." The statement, "Only a Sith deals in absolutes," is itself an absolute statement. Which leads me to conclude that the Jedi and the Sith were equally absolutist in their views, with perhaps the only difference being the Sith were aware of their absolutism, while the Jedi were blind to or in denial about their own. The prophecy related to Anakin Skywalker stated that he would restore balance to the Force, which suggests that the Force at one time was previously balanced. So I think we should ask ourselves, who was responsible for throwing the Force out of balance in the first place? Now, the trilogies do not provide us any direct evidence, so we'll have to infer a bit. It seems to me that a logical answer would be, well, whomever would stand to benefit most from such an imbalance. So we ask ourselves, who benefited from the imbalance? Well, it would be the same party that would have wanted to have stopped the prophecy of balance from being fulfilled, because that would threaten all of their benefits. So who in the new trilogy had all the power? Who was the recognized authority over the Force? Who was it that had all the power working side by side with the Galactic Senate? It was the Jedi Order. And who is it in the movies that tried to stop the prophecy from being fulfilled? The Jedi Order. When Anakin as a child is presented to the Jedi as the chosen one who will bring balance to the Force, the Jedi initially refuse to train him. Why? Because he represented a threat to the status quo, which included the Jedi Order's monopoly on power. Even when the Jedi Council finally begrudgingly agrees to train Anakin, the leader of the Council, Master Yoda himself, argues against the decision. Why? Because Yoda, as leader of the Jedi Order, would have had the most to lose if the Force became balanced and the Jedi Order's power and authority was diminished or destroyed. For these reasons, I think it is safe to infer that years before the events of Episode 1, it was actually the Jedi who strategically polarized the Force, labeling their side of the Force as light and declaring it was all good, and demonizing and vilifying their opposition, the Sith, by labeling their side of the Force as dark and declaring it all evil. Thus, the Jedi Order, as a religious institution, set themselves up to be the sole legitimate authority, the sole legitimate arbiters, apologists, and high priests of the Force. Their interpretation of the Force became the orthodoxy of the galaxy. The moral tragedy of Star Wars isn't simply the temptation and fall of Anakin Skywalker. It's actually, I believe, the temptation and fall of the Jedi. The Jedi started as a group with good intentions. They were tempted by power, which led them to polarize their religion by vilifying those with whom they did not agree, which served to further radicalize their opposition, creating a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of evil. Now, for anyone who follows geopolitics, I ask you if this pattern sounds familiar. You see, the Jedi banished all dissent, all difference of opinion, all diversity from their order, and then labeled the new outsiders as evil heretics. This, of course, is exactly what happened to our own theological ancestors, the Unitarians and the Universalists. Our forebears were on the wrong side of the religious power equation hundreds of years ago. But we cannot conveniently end the critique at the point where we are simply the victims, because history repeats itself, often ironically. We UUs, we of the liberal religious tradition, we too must heed the warnings of history, because there is a temptation for us to fall into the old ruts that others have dug out over the centuries. A temptation for us to see the world similarly in black and white, in terms of a light side and a dark side, a clearly good side and a clearly evil side, to proclaim ourselves the guardians of the true morality, and to consolidate our power by demonizing all who dissent, all who disagree with us. The danger is not that they might be right and we might be wrong. The danger is not that they might gain followers and become more powerful than us. The danger is in either side banishing the other from a place at the table, refusing to hear and see the potential value and truth in their respective positions, thus making authentic conversation impossible. The real danger, the real evil, is the suppression of dissent by labeling all dissent as inherently evil. What happened to the Jedi could happen to us. Professor and theologian Sharon Welch writes the following: I would argue that the suppression of dissent occurs when a revolutionary vanguard, a group committed to the good of all, becomes isolated from other people and begins to see itself as the primary bearer of the revolutionary vision. The idolatry emerges from a hope cut loose from its moorings in community with people of many backgrounds. We live in an increasingly polarized nation and polarized world, with much talking and little listening, where those who disagree, if they cannot be converted, are simply demonized and expelled from fellowship. It is a dangerous time, to be sure, and a depressing one. I think I'm going to go back to the Star Wars universe for just a second. Ultimately, in Star Wars, we see that Anakin does fulfill the prophecy. Over the course of both trilogies, Anakin destroyed the institutions at the poles of the Force where power had pooled. He first destroys the Jedi, then years later the Sith. With the removal of both the fundamentalist Jedi Order and the radicalized Sith, the Force was no longer controlled by powerful established religious institutions. It was free to find its own natural and harmonious balance. And I think we should also note that Anakin ended the rule of the Sith only when he saw his son Luke being tortured and killed by the Emperor. So in other words, the Sith Lord Darth Vader is ironically saved from the dark side ultimately by his passionate attachment to his son, itself a dark side attribute. If my thesis this morning is correct, then I believe that we should approach the Force, or as we call it in our reality, the divine, with an understanding of the virtues and dangers of both sides. The light represents our noble attempts to transcend beyond our natural but often destructive human frailties, weaknesses, instincts, and prejudices by celebrating knowledge, wisdom, reason, and peace. The light is the realm of the mind and the spirit, while the dark promotes embracing all that makes us human and ties us to this earth. It celebrates the emotions, the passions, the will, the drive, struggle, the inscrutable and unknowable mysteries of being. The dark is the realm of the heart and the soul. It's not a question of either or. It's both and. And no institution should have a complete monopoly on what we all recognize and share as divine. I don't know what Episode 7 has in store for the Star Wars universe. Maybe on December 18th, everything I just said will go up in a puff of smoke. But I'm very much looking forward to the new insights, new truths, and especially the new arguments that are in store for all of us fans of the series. And I take solace knowing that the transcendent yet very human values of justice and compassion and freedom still have meaning, even a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Blessed be.